Wyoming Territory, summer of 1878. Stand down. Clara screamed through the pouring rain, throwing herself in front of the battered rancher. Her terrified eyes locked onto her father's as armed men closed in from every side. Move aside, Harlan Vance growled, his face cold with fury. That half Comanche belongs on the gallows. With tears streaming down her face, Clara shook her head. Then you'll have to kill me first. What could make a wealthy railroad heiress betray her own father for the man he swore to destroy? This is the unforgettable story of love, courage, and the price of choosing what's right. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Clara Vance pressed her gloved hand against the carriage window and watched Wyoming roll by in a haze of dust and heat. She had pictured the frontier 100 different ways on the long train ride west. None of them looked like this. The town ahead was a scatter of raw wood buildings, baking under a white sky. More mud than street, more grit than glory. Her father called it opportunity. Clara called it, silently, a place that swallowed people whole. Sit up straight, Harlan Vance said without looking at her. He never needed to look at her to correct her. 24 years had taught him exactly where to aim his voice so it landed like a slap. The men who run this territory will be watching. I won't have them thinking I raised a wilting flower. Clara straightened her spine. She had learned that lesson early. Obedience cost less than defiance, and she had grown up counting every cost. The carriage slowed as it entered town, wheels catching in ruts. And that was when she saw him. A crowd had gathered near a burned fence line at the edge of a small farm. Two men on horseback held whips, their faces shadowed under wide hats, and between them and a trembling family stood a third man. He was tall, dark-haired, built like something carved rather than born. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. Blood had dried along his jaw. He did not raise a weapon. He simply stood there, arms loose at his sides, unmoving, like a man who understood that his body was the only wall left between violence and the people behind him. Touch them again, he said, his voice carrying easy and low across the dirt, and you'll answer to more than the sheriff. One of the whip-holding men laughed. The other did not. Something in the stranger's stillness made even a coward think twice. Clara's father chuckled from beside her, low and satisfied. That's the one they call Gray. Half Comanche, if the rumors are true. Thinks he can hold back progress with his bare hands. He knocked twice on the carriage roof. Move on. I've seen enough. But Clara had not. She turned in her seat, ignoring the pinch of her corset, and watched the man called Gray through the small back window until the dust swallowed him whole. He never once looked afraid, even surrounded, even outnumbered. He stood like a man who had already decided what he was willing to lose. She realized, with a small shock, that she envied him. By evening, Harlan Vance had taken over the finest room the town's one hotel had to offer, and he wasted no time turning it into a war room. Ledgers were spread across the table. Sheriff Miller sat across from him, hat in hand, nodding along like a dog waiting for scraps. The water rights run through here, Harlan said, tapping a map with 2 fingers. Whoever controls this stretch controls every farm for 20 miles. I want it signed, sealed in mine before the month is out. There's homesteaders on that land, Miller said carefully, and the natives use it for grazing. Come autumn, then they'll graze somewhere else. Harlan didn't even glance up. This is how empires get built. Miller. Somebody always has to move. Clara stood near the window, close enough to hear every word, far enough to be forgotten. That was how her father preferred her. Present, decorative silent, a daughter groomed since birth, for a good marriage and a better bloodline. Engaged now to a senator's son she had met exactly twice. She thought of the man in the dust, the one who stood his ground while other men swung whips. She thought of herself, standing in silk in a hotel room, saying nothing, while her father drew lines across a map that would burn down someone's home. The comparison sat badly in her stomach. The next morning, against every rule of propriety, Clara asked the hotel's stable boy where she might find the man called Gray Thorn. He blinked at her like she'd asked directions to the moon. But the promise of a coin loosened his tongue quick enough. Ranch out past the ridge, he said, old Elias's place. Everybody knew it. She told her lady's maid she wanted air. She told herself the same lie the whole ride out. The ranch, when she found it, was nothing like her father's world. No gates, no guilt, no men in fine coats deciding the fate of people they'd never met. Just a modest house, a corral, and a dozen horses eyeing her with more suspicion than the men in town ever had. She saw him before he saw her. Graythorn stood inside the corral fence, and in front of him a mustang paced and snorted, wild-eyed, ears pinned flat. Clara expected him to reach for a whip. Instead, he stood perfectly still, hands open at his sides, and simply waited. Minutes passed. The horse circled, tossed its head, tested him. Gray said nothing. He didn't chase. He didn't force. He let the animal come to its own conclusion, in its own time. Finally, the mustang stopped, took one step closer, then another. Gray reached up, slow as sunrise, and laid his palm against its neck. Clara realized she had been holding her breath. You're standing too close to the fence for someone who claims she's just passing through, Gray said, not turning around. Her face went hot. I wasn't aware. I needed permission to admire good work. Now he did turn, and his eyes found hers across the corral, steady and unreadable. Up close, the scar along his jaw looked older than yesterday's bruises, older than anything that had happened in that dusty street. Most folks who come from town don't call breaking a horse good work, he said. Most folks want it broken fast, beaten till it stops fighting. That's not breaking, Clara said, before she could stop herself. That's just teaching something to be afraid. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. Something closer to reconsideration. You're Vance's daughter, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. Then you should go home. Miss Vance. Nothing good ever came from your family looking too close at mine. He turned back to the mustang before she could answer. And the conversation ended as plainly as it had started. But Clara didn't move right away. She stood at that fence a moment longer, watching a man gentle a wild thing with nothing but patience and respect. And she thought of her own life, laced tight since birth, taught obedience instead of trust. She rode back to town with dust on her boots and a question lodged in her chest that she couldn't yet name, but it would not leave her alone. Clara didn't sleep that night. She lay in the hotel's stiff bed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling, shaped like nothing in particular, and turned over the morning's conversation until it wore smooth in her mind. You should go home. Miss Vance. He'd said it plain. No anger in it, just fact. Like he already knew how her family's story ended for people like him. She thought about the homesteaders on the road, the whip marks on their fence posts, her father's calm voice discussing water rights, like a man discussing the weather. She thought about the Mustang's circling gray thorn, wild and furious, and how it had come to him anyway. Not because he forced it, because he waited. By dawn, she'd made up her mind about something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. She dressed quietly, chose her plainest riding clothes, and told her maid she needed air again. The lie came easier the second time. That should have troubled her more than it did. The family from the burned fence line, she learned from the stable boy, had a name. The Coopers, Sarah Cooper and her husband Thomas, 2 children, and a grandmother whose lungs hadn't been right since the fire took half their barn. No doctor in town would ride out, for people the sheriff had already marked as trouble. Clara found their farm before the sun cleared the ridge, and she left an envelope of money with the eldest Cooper boy, along with strict instructions not to mention where it came from. Tell them a stranger left it, she said. Tell them nothing else. The boy, maybe 10 years old, stared at the sum inside the envelope like it might catch fire. Why? Clara didn't have a good answer. Because your grandmother needs a doctor, she said instead. And because it's the only decent thing I can do today that won't get anyone killed. She rode on toward the ridge after that, telling herself she only wanted to see if the boy's family was truly as desperate as they'd looked. She told herself a lot of things that morning that weren't quite true. Graythorn's ranch sat quiet in the early light. And this time she found him already in the corral, working with a different horse. This one was smaller, a young mare with a scar across her flank and eyes that flicked toward every sound. Clara tied her own horse to the fence and climbed up to sit on the top rail. Uninvited. You again, Gray said, not turning. Me again. I told you yesterday. Nothing good comes from you looking too close at my business. I'm not looking at your business, Clara said. I'm looking at your horse. He almost smiled at that. Almost. She caught the corner of it before he smoothed it away. The mare paced the far end of the corral, keeping her distance from both of them, ears swiveling at every creak of leather. Gray stood with his back half turned to her, shoulders loose, hands empty. He didn't approach. He didn't call out. He simply existed in the same space as the horse and let her decide what to make of him. She won't come to you if you don't ask her to, Clara said. She'll come when she trusts me enough to ask on her own terms. He glanced back at Clara then, and there was something sharp in his eyes. Not unkind, just direct. That's the whole trick. Miss Vance, everybody wants to skip to the part where the animal listens. Nobody wants to sit through the part where you earn it. My father would say that's a waste of time. He breaks things faster. Your father breaks things and calls it business. Gray turned back to the mare. I've seen what he breaks. Farms, families. This land, if he gets his way, with the water rights. Breaking's easy. Miss Vance, anybody can break something. Building trust back up again. That's the hard part. And most men don't have the patience for hard. Clara sat with that a moment, feeling it land somewhere she didn't want it to. How do you do it? Then, she asked, build the trust. Gray crouched slowly, lowering himself so he was no taller than the mare's shoulder, and waited. The horse watched him a long moment, snorted once, took 2 steps closer. He didn't reach for her. He let her come the rest of the way herself, until her nose brushed his outstretched hand, and only then did he touch her, slow, along the side of her neck. You don't break a spirit and call it loyalty, ma'am, he said quietly, not looking away from the horse. You respect their fear. You let them see you're not going to hurt them, over and over, until believing it stops feeling like a risk. Then they give you their strength, willingly. That's worth 10 times what you get from a whip. Clara sat very still on the fence rail. Something about the words settled into her chest, like they'd been waiting there a long time for someone to finally say them out loud. My father broke me the same way he breaks his horses, she said, before she could stop herself. Except nobody ever taught me I was allowed to come back on my own terms. Gray looked up at her then, really looked, like he was reconsidering something he'd already decided about her. Maybe nobody's asked you to trust anything worth trusting, he said. Maybe that's not the same as being broken for good. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The mare grew bolder, nudging at Gray's shoulder, and he laughed, low and surprised, like the sound didn't come easy to him. Clara watched the two of them and felt, for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming, like she was looking at something true. An older man came out from the house then, Gray at the temples, moving, with the careful economy of someone who'd worked hard his whole life and intended to keep working a while longer. He nodded to Clara without surprise. Like strange women, showing up at the fence line was nothing new. Elias, Gray said, straightening. This is Miss Vance. I know who she is. Elias's eyes were kind but sharp, taking her in without judgment and without warmth either. Harlan Vance's girl, come to see the animals, or come to see the man. Clara felt her face heat. Both, I suppose. Elias grunted, something that might have been approval. Well, the horses don't care whose blood you carry. Neither does Gray, though he'll pretend otherwise a while longer. He clapped Gray on the shoulder, ignoring the look Gray shot him. Come on in, Miss Vance, if you're staying. Sun's getting high, and I imagine your father doesn't know you're out here at all. He was right about that. And the thought of what her father would do if he found out settled cold in her stomach. But she stayed anyway, sitting with Elias and Gray on the porch through the heat of midday, listening to Elias talk about the community out past the ridge. Homesteaders. A few Shoshone families who'd been using the same grazing land for longer than the territory had a name. people who had nothing, by her father's measure, and everything by theirs. Your father's after the water, Elias said eventually, watching her face as he said it. You understand what that means for the people out here, come winter, if he gets it. Clara understood exactly what it meant. She just hadn't let herself think it through until she was sitting on Elias's porch, with the truth laid out so plainly. I'll do what I can, she said, and it sounded thin even to her own ears. But something in her had shifted since the corral, since the mare's nose against Gray's open palm, since the words about breaking and trust. She rode home that afternoon with dust on her boots and a decision forming in her, slow and stubborn, like something learning to trust its own legs. 3 days passed before Clara found her chance, and when it came by accident. Her father had summoned Sheriff Miller to the hotel room again, later than usual, well past supper, and Clara had already gone to her own room down the hall. She should have stayed there. She told herself later that she hadn't planned anything, that she'd only gone back down for a shawl she'd left in the sitting room, and found the door to her father's study cracked open, voices low and urgent on the other side. She should have walked past. Instead, she stood in the hallway shadow and listened. The Coopers took in help from somewhere, Miller was saying. Doctor came out from 2 counties over. Somebody's paying for it. Then find out who, her father said, and make sure it stops. I don't need charity undoing what I've spent months arranging. There's a bigger problem than the Coopers. Miller's voice dropped lower, and Clara had to press closer to the door to catch it. That Mustang tamer, Thorne, and the old man Elias. They've been rallying the homesteaders, talking about filing a joint claim on the water rights before your papers go through. If they organize fast enough, they could tie this up in court for a year. Her father was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had the flat calm Clara had learned to fear more than any shout. Then we don't give them a year. We give them a night. There's a native encampment using that grazing land, same as the homesteaders. Shoshone families. Been there generations. No paper to their name because your predecessor never bothered to record it properly. A chair creaked. Clara pictured her father leaning back, the way he did when he'd already solved a problem in his mind, and was simply enjoying the shape of it. Tomorrow night, while the moon's dark, your men burn out the camp. Make it look like trouble between the tribes and the homesteaders. An uprising. Whatever story plays best in the papers. By morning, there won't be enough people left with a claim to organize anything, and I'll have my water rights signed inside the week. That's a lot of people, Mr. Vance. Miller didn't sound like a man objecting. He sounded like a man doing arithmetic. Women, children. That's a lot of land standing empty by Thursday, her father said. You've been paid well enough not to count the cost. Miller, do your job. Clara stood frozen in the hallway, one hand pressed flat against the wall to keep herself upright, and felt something break loose inside her that she couldn't name yet. She had known her father was ruthless. She had known his business dealings left bruises on people she'd never meet. But this was not business. This was murder, dressed up in a story for the newspapers. And he was discussing it the way other men discussed crop prices. She thought of the Cooper boy staring at the money in his hands. She thought of Elias's careful, weathered face on the porch, talking about winter without water. She thought of Graythorne standing between armed men and a family that wasn't his own, unarmed, unafraid, because somebody had to be the wall. Tomorrow night, the moon dark. A whole community burned to make her father richer. She backed away from the door before her legs gave out entirely, and made it to her own room before the shaking started in earnest. She sat on the edge of her bed a long time, hands pressed to her mouth, trying to think past the roaring in her ears. Every year of her life had trained her toward one single skill, obedience, and every instinct in her now screamed against it. If she told anyone, her father's people, if she asked for help, through any channel that touched his world, it would come straight back to him before sundown. There was no one in this town she could trust that wasn't already bought. There was only the ranch out past the ridge, and the man who'd told her that trust had to be earned before it was given. She thought of her comfortable bed, her silk dresses, The senator's son she was engaged to marry, a life built entirely on land her father had taken by force and blood before her. She had spent 24 years being decorative and silent, while men like her father did exactly this, over and over, to people who couldn't fight back. Not tonight, she decided, whatever it cost her. Not tonight. She didn't sleep. She sat by the window instead, watching the dark settle over the town, running through every version of a plan that might work and finding every one of them thin and desperate. But desperate was better than nothing, and nothing was what her whole life had trained her to offer. By the time the sky started to gray toward morning, she had made her choice. Even if she didn't yet know how she'd carry it out, she would ride to Graythorn's ranch, and she would warn him, and she would deal with what came after, when after actually arrived. She packed nothing. She left no note. She simply waited for the household to fall quiet, and then she went to the stable and took the fastest horse she could find that wasn't her father's prize gelding, and rode out into a night that felt, for the first time in her life, entirely her own to lose. The storm hadn't been in the sky when she left. It found her halfway to the ridge, rolling in fast and black from the west. The kind of Wyoming storm that turned a clear night into chaos inside 20 minutes. Clara had ridden before, plenty of times, always on smooth trails with a groom trailing behind her in case of trouble. She had never ridden like this. Rain came sideways, hard enough to sting, and the horse beneath her fought the wind with every stride, ears pinned flat, hooves slipping in mud that hadn't existed an hour earlier. She lost the trail twice. Both times she found it again by instinct alone, some half-remembered sense of the ridgeline against a sky gone completely black. Lightning split the horizon every few minutes, throwing the land into stark white relief before swallowing it again, and each flash showed her a little more of just how far she still had to go. The river crossing was the worst of it. She hadn't expected the water to be so high, hadn't accounted for a storm swelling a creek she remembered, as barely knee-deep into something wide and furious, and the color of tea. Her horse balked at the edge of it, and for a long, terrible moment, Clara sat there in the rain, soaked through, shaking, and thought about turning back. She thought about the Shoshone camp instead, children asleep in their beds, same as the Cooper children, families with no idea that tomorrow night meant fire. She kicked the horse forward. The current hit them both like a wall. Clara felt the animal's legs go out from under it for one heart-stopping second, felt herself pitch sideways into water so cold it drove the air clean out of her lungs, and grabbed a fistful of mane with both hands because there was nothing else to hold on to. The horse fought its way back under itself somehow, scrambling for footing on the far bank, and Clara clung to its neck the whole way, half in the water and half out, until solid ground finally came up beneath them both. She lay against the horse's heaving side a moment, gasping before she made herself sit up and keep going. Her dress had torn somewhere in the crossing, the fine fabric shredded at the hem and soaked black with mud, and she looked down at it in a flash of lightning and felt something strange settle over her. Not grief for the dress, relief almost, at the sight of it ruined, as if the silk had been a costume all along, and she was finally shedding the last of it. By the time she reached the ranch, dawn was still an hour off, and the storm had softened to a steady, miserable rain. She half fell from the horse at the fence line, legs unsteady beneath her, and it was Elias who found her first, coming out with a lantern at the sound of hooves, his face going from wary to alarmed in the space of a breath. "Miss Vance?" He caught her before she went down entirely. "Lord above. Girl, what happened to you? Where's Gray?" Clara managed, teeth chattering hard enough to slur the words. "I have to talk to him. Now tonight. There isn't time." Elias didn't waste breath asking more questions. He shouted toward the house, and Gray came out at a run, shirt half buttoned, and stopped cold at the sight of her, soaked through and shaking and barely standing. "What happened?" he said, already moving to catch her other side. "My father." Clara grabbed his arm, hard enough that her nails must have bitten through his sleeve. "Tonight, he's sending men to burn the Shoshone camp. Make it look like an uprising between them and the homesteaders. He's doing it tonight. Gray while the moon's dark. So there's no one left to fight the water rights claim. For one long moment, nobody moved. Rain dripped off the porch roof in a steady patter. And somewhere behind the house a horse wickered low in its stall. And Gray Thorn stared at her like he was trying to decide if the woman in front of him could possibly be telling the truth. You rode out here, alone. In this, I didn't have a choice. You had every choice, he said, but there was no anger in it. Only something rawer, something like disbelief. You could have stayed in your warm bed and let it happen, and never lost a night's sleep over it. I couldn't, Clara said, and her voice cracked on it. Finally, all the fear and cold and fury of the last hours breaking loose at once. I couldn't let it happen and call myself decent afterward. I don't care what it costs me. I won't have those children's deaths sitting on my hands the way everything else in my life already does. Gray looked at her a long moment, rain running down both their faces, and something in his expression shifted. The last of his guard sliding away like it had never been that sturdy to begin with. Elias, he said, not looking away from her. Wake the others. We ride for the camp now. Tell them to move everything they can carry before first light. Miss Vance. Clara, she said. Just Clara. Clara, he said it like he was testing the shape of it. Get inside. Get dry. Before you catch your death out here, after riding through a river to save people who never asked you to. I'm coming with you. You can barely stand. I'm coming with you, she said again. And something stubborn and unbreakable rose up behind the words. The same thing that had gotten her across a flooded river in the dark. I started this tonight. I'm going to see it through. Gray studied her a moment longer, rain-soaked and shaking and utterly resolved. And something that might have been respect moved behind his eyes. Get her dry clothes, he said to Elias. Then saddle 3 more horses. We've got a camp to move before sunup, and not nearly enough time to do it. The rain kept falling as the ranch came alive around them. Lanterns lit, horses saddled, urgent voices calling instructions into the dark. Clara stood in the middle of it, soaked and freezing, and more awake than she had ever felt in her whole sheltered life, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that there was no road back to the woman she'd been 3 days ago. That woman had drowned somewhere in that river, and whatever came next, she would meet it as someone new. The camp came alive fast, once the warning spread, and Clara watched a whole community fold itself into wagons and packs with the kind of quiet efficiency that told her this wasn't the first time they'd had to move quickly. No panic, no wasted motion. Just families working shoulder to shoulder in the rain. Children herded onto wagons. Elders settled with blankets. Everything that mattered folded into bundles small enough to carry. An older Shoshone woman pressed a bundle of dried herbs into Clara's hands without a word of explanation, then moved on to the next task before Clara could even thank her. A young man named Tall Bear helped Elias hitch the last wagon, while Gray moved through the camp checking every family, every wagon, every face, making sure nobody got left behind in the dark and the rain. You've done this before, Clara said to him. Once the last wagon rolled out onto the trail, too many times. Gray swung up onto his horse, water running off the brim of his hat. Your father isn't the first man who's decided this land would be worth more without the people living on it. They rode at the back of the column, watching for stragglers, watching for riders who might come looking for trouble before dawn. The storm had eased to a hard, steady rain by then, but the creek beds were running full, and twice they had to find alternate crossings when the usual fords turned into churning brown water. It was the second crossing that broke them off from the rest. A flash flood came down the narrow wash without warning, water rising fast enough that the wagons ahead had to push through before the trail vanished entirely. And Clara's horse spooked at the sudden roar of it, bolting sideways into a side canyon before she could get it back under control. By the time Gray caught up to her, the water behind them had risen too high and too fast to cross back through. We're cut off, he said, looking back at the wall of moving water. They'll be fine. They know this land. They'll make camp on the far side and wait out the flood. We need shelter, now before this canyon fills too. He found it a quarter-mile up the wash, a narrow slot in the rock. Dry and high enough above the flood line to be safe. Just wide enough for 2 people and 2 horses if they stood close. They led the animals in and settled them as best they could, and then there was nothing left to do but wait out the storm together in the dark. Gray got a small fire going from dry brush tucked deep in a rock alcove. More smoke than flame at first, but enough to cut the worst of the chill. Clara sat close to it, arms wrapped around her knees. Still in the borrowed shirt and trousers, Elias's wife had found for her back at the ranch. Her own ruined dress, packed away in a saddlebag like evidence of a life she'd already half abandoned. "Thank you," she said, watching the fire catch properly, for getting everyone out, for not asking more questions than you needed to. "Thank you for riding through a flooded river to warn us," Gray said. "I haven't said that yet. I should have said it hours ago. You didn't trust me hours ago. I didn't know you hours ago." He fed another piece of brush into the flame. "Now I do. That's different." They sat quiet a while, listening to the rain outside the slot canyon, the fire popping softly between them. Clara found herself watching his hands, the same hands that had gentled a wild mustang with nothing but patience, and wondered what it had cost him to learn that kind of stillness in a world that had clearly never offered him much patience in return. "Elias said you carry scars," she said, and immediately wished she'd said it differently. Softer, less like an accusation. "I didn't mean that the way it sounded." Gray didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone quieter, stripped of its usual careful control. "My mother was Comanche. My father was a rancher who never once called her his wife, not where anyone could hear it." He turned a piece of brush over in his hands before feeding it to the flame. "When I was 12, some of the hands on his ranch decided I didn't belong there either way. Not white enough for one side, not native enough to be welcomed fully on the other. They made sure I understood that with a whip. Same as your father's men use on homesteaders who don't fall in line." Clara's chest went tight, and she made herself keep listening, instead of filling the silence with something useless. "My father did nothing to stop it," Gray went on. "Told me afterward that I should be grateful they'd left me alive to learn the lesson. I left that ranch 2 years later and never went back. Elias found me half-starved and half-frozen out past the territory line. Took me in like I was his own. Taught me everything I know about horses and about people worth trusting." He glanced up at her. "That's the short version. I don't tell the long one to anybody." "Why tell me the short one?" "Because you rode through a flood to warn people who aren't yours to protect," he said. "That buys a person some trust in my accounting." Clara moved closer without entirely deciding to, until she was near enough to see the old scarring at his collar, where his shirt had torn during the confrontation days earlier. She reached out. Slow, the way he'd taught the Mustang to expect slowness instead of sudden movement, and touched the edge of the scar at his shoulder. He flinched, just slightly, an old instinct flaring despite himself. "Scars don't mean you're ruined." "Silas," she said, using his given name for the first time, testing it gently against the dark. "They're just proof that you refuse to be destroyed." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw moving behind his eyes, like nobody had ever offered him that particular reframing before. Like he'd spent his whole life believing the marks on his body were evidence of defeat rather than survival. "Nobody's ever put it that way," he said quietly. "Then somebody should have." "What about you?" he said. "Your own scars, the ones that don't show." Clara considered how to answer that honestly, without dressing it in the polite language her whole upbringing had trained into her. "My father raised me the way he breaks his horses," she said finally. "Whip first. Patience never. Every rebellion beaten out of me before I was old enough to understand I was allowed to have one. I learned to disappear into silence, because silence never earned a punishment. I learned obedience because it was the only currency I had that kept me safe. And tonight I spent every bit of that currency at once," she said, and something in her voice cracked despite her best effort to hold it steady. I don't know what's left of me now that I've spent it. I only know I couldn't keep buying safety with other people's lives. Gray reached out then, slow and careful, and took her hand where it still rested, near his shoulder. His palm was rough, calloused from years of rope and rain, and his grip was gentle in a way that surprised her, like he understood exactly how much strength to withhold. "You're not what I expected, Clara Vance," he said. "Neither are you, Silas Thorne." The fire burned low between them, and the rain kept falling outside the narrow shelter of rock. And for the first time in either of their lives, the silence between two people felt like safety instead of danger. Neither of them spoke for a long while after that. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold had crept back into the slot canyon, despite the rock walls holding the worst of the wind at bay. And Clara found herself moving closer to him without any clear decision to do it, simply following the same instinct that had carried her across a flooded river hours earlier. Gray shifted his coat off his shoulders and settled it around her instead. And when she looked up to thank him, something in the way he was watching her stopped the words in her throat. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "Give me the coat. Sit close for warmth. I understand cold. Clara, I don't need you to feel obligated toward me because of tonight." "I'm not doing anything out of obligation," she said. "Then what are you doing?" She didn't have a clean answer, not one built from the careful, proper language she'd been raised on. So instead of answering with words, she reached up and touched the side of his face, tracing the old scar along his jaw the same way she'd touched the one on his shoulder, and felt him go very still under her palm, like a man holding his breath against something he wanted badly enough to be afraid of it. "I've spent my whole life being told what I'm allowed to want," she said. "Tonight I lost the only life that ever told me that. I don't know what comes after this, Silas. I only know I don't want to spend another hour of it pretending I don't want to be close to you." His hands came up slowly, framing her face the way he'd once framed the Mustangs. Patient, careful, giving her every chance to pull away if she needed to. She didn't pull away. She leaned into it instead, and felt him exhale like something in him had been holding tight for a very long time, and had finally let go. She reached for the laces at the collar of the borrowed shirt, her fingers unsteady but sure of their intention, and Gray's hands came up to cover hers, not stopping her, just steadying her, his own hands trembling faintly against hers, in a way she doubted he'd admit to if she named it aloud. "You're shaking," she whispered. "So are you. I don't think it's the cold." "No," he said, low, almost wondering. "I don't think it is either." What passed between them after that belonged to no one but themselves. Private, in the way the firelight was private, in the way the narrow shelter of rock held them apart from the storm and the world, and every rule either of them had been raised inside. Whatever else the night had taken from her, whatever else waited beyond the canyon walls. In that hour, Clara Vance was not her father's daughter, and Silas Thorne was not a man the world had told to expect nothing. They were simply two people who had earned, at terrible cost, the right to choose each other. It didn't last. The first sound was a horse's whinny, sharp and wrong against the quiet, and Gray was on his feet before Clara had even registered the wrongness of it, reaching for his rifle where it leaned against the rock. "Get dressed," he said, voice gone flat and urgent. "Now, Clara." But there wasn't time. Lantern light flooded the mouth of the slot canyon, and behind it came men, 6 or 7 of them, rifles already raised. And Clara recognized Sheriff Miller's voice before she saw his face. "Found her." Miller called back toward the darkness, just like the tracker said. "Followed the horse straight here." Gray moved to put himself between Clara and the guns, the same way he had moved between the Coopers and her father's men. But there were too many this time, and they weren't interested in warnings. The first rifle butt caught him across the temple before he'd even finished raising his own weapon, and Clara screamed his name as he went down. And then there were hands on her, dragging her backward out of the canyon, while more men closed in around Gray, boots and rifle stocks landing with a brutality that turned her scream into something raw and wordless. "Stop," she screamed, fighting against the arms holding her. "Stop, you're going to kill him. Stop." Nobody stopped. She watched, helpless, as they beat him until he stopped moving entirely, until his face was unrecognizable in the lantern light, until the only mercy left was that she couldn't tell anymore whether he was breathing. Her father was waiting outside the canyon, sitting his horse with the same calm expression he wore over a business ledger. And when he looked at her, disheveled and half-dressed and screaming another man's name into the rain, something in his face closed like a door. "Get her decent," he said to the man holding her, not a flicker of feeling in his voice. "And someone bring a rope for that animal she was with. I want him alive long enough to hang properly, in front of witnesses. So every homesteader in this territory understands exactly what happens to men who touch what's mine." "I'm not yours," Clara said, voice breaking. "I never was. I'm not property. Father, I never was property, no matter how many years you spent pretending otherwise." "You were my daughter," Harlan said, and something almost like grief passed behind his eyes before the coldness swallowed it whole. "Now you're a ruined, hysterical woman who threw away everything I built for her over a half-breed Mustang tamer. There's an asylum 2 counties over that, in exactly this kind of hysteria. I've already sent word ahead." "Father, you're not my daughter anymore," he said, turning his horse away from her. "Take her back to town. Lock her in the east room until the carriage arrives." They dragged Clara away as the rain kept falling, and the last thing she saw of Silas Thorne before the darkness swallowed the canyon entirely was his broken, unmoving shape on the ground, surrounded by men who had already stopped seeing him as anything more than a lesson to be taught. The east room had bars on the window and a lock on the outside of the door, and Clara understood. Sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, with her wrists still raw from being bound during the ride back, that her father had prepared this room for her long before tonight. He hadn't decided to disown her in a moment of anger. He had built the cage in advance, the way he built everything, patient and methodical, waiting only for the excuse. A doctor came sometime near dawn, a thin man with cold hands and colder eyes, and asked her a series of questions in a flat, bored voice. Did she hear voices? Did she understand that her behavior had been improper? Did she recognize that her father only wanted what was best for her fragile constitution? Clara answered honestly at first, and watched every honest answer get written down as further evidence of her hysteria. Until she understood, there was no version of truth that would help her here. The verdict had been reached before the questions were ever asked. "The carriage will come for her in 2 days," the doctor told the guard outside her door, not bothering to lower his voice, as if Clara herself had already stopped being a person worth addressing directly. "Keep her sedated if she becomes difficult. The asylum prefers patients arrive calm. 2 days." Clara sat with that number a long while after the door locked behind him, turning it over like a stone in her palm. 2 days until she disappeared into a building designed to make women like her vanish quietly, permanently, without a trial or a voice or anyone left to ask questions. She thought of Silas, broken and unmoving on the canyon floor, and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite grief yet, because grief required certainty, and she didn't know if he was alive to grieve. She only knew that if he was alive, he was in a cell somewhere in her father's territory, waiting for a hangman's rope, and that nobody was coming to save either of them. Her father had made sure of that. He'd built his whole empire on making sure nobody who mattered ever came to save the people he'd decided to discard. She sat with her back against the cold wall and let herself feel the full weight of it, the fear, the helplessness, the low grinding fury that had been building in her for days and had nowhere left to go. She let it sit there a long time, because she understood something about grief and fury both. If she let it consume her too fast, it would burn out and leave her empty. Better to let it bank down slow, like coal, until it could carry her somewhere useful. By midnight, she noticed the guard's habits. He checked the door every hour, precise as a clock, and between checks he sat in the hallway with a bottle he thought nobody knew about. dulling the boredom of a long night, watching a locked door. He was not a cruel man, she thought, just a tired one, doing a job that paid well enough not to ask questions. That made him predictable. Predictable men could be used. She looked around the room for anything useful and found almost nothing. A water pitcher, a basin, a narrow bed with an iron frame, a single chair, bare walls, bare floor. Every comfort stripped away in preparation for a woman they expected to break quietly and without incident. She thought of Silas in the corral, patient with a frightened Mustang, teaching it that stillness could be trusted before it could be commanded. She thought of the words he'd said to her that first morning, about respecting fear instead of breaking it, about earning trust instead of forcing it. She had spent her whole life being taught the opposite lesson, that fear was something done to you, that trust was something extracted through obedience. Tonight, alone in a locked room with nothing left to lose, she finally understood the lesson in full. If nobody was going to come earn her trust, if nobody was going to come save her, then she would have to be the one to earn her own way out. She looked at the water pitcher a long time before she made her decision. She waited until the guard's hourly check had just passed, giving herself the longest possible stretch before the next one. And then she gathered every ounce of resolve left in her and pulled the pitcher off the small table, wrapped it in the thin blanket to muffle the sound, and brought it down hard against the iron bed frame. It shattered quieter than she expected, most of the noise absorbed by the blanket, leaving her with a scatter of jagged shards and a strange, cold clarity settling over her. She picked up the largest piece, turned it in the moonlight coming through the barred window, and reached up to gather the length of her hair in her other hand. It had taken her whole life to grow, cared for by maids, brushed 100 strokes each night, praised by suitors and relatives alike as her crowning feature, the mark of a proper young lady raised for a proper marriage. She thought of every hour spent sitting still while someone else decided what to do with it. Every compliment that had really been a cage disguised as flattery. She cut it off in rough, uneven handfuls, the glass biting cold and sharp against her palm, until the floor around her was scattered with dark curls, and her head felt strange and light, in a way that made her almost laugh out loud. She looked nothing like Harlan Vance's daughter anymore. She looked like someone dangerous. She decided she preferred it. She wrapped the largest shard of glass in a strip torn from her ruined dress, tucking it into her sleeve, and settled the blanket carefully over the mess of hair and broken pitcher on the floor. Then she began to scream. It wasn't difficult to sound convincing. She let every real emotion of the last 2 days pour into it. The terror, the grief, the fury, twisted into something that sounded like a woman finally shattering under the weight of what had been done to her. She heard the guard's chair scrape back in the hallway, heard his boots hurrying toward the door, heard the scrape of the key in the lock. Miss Vance, Miss Vance, calm yourself, I'm coming in. The door swung open, and he stepped through with a lantern raised, and Clara let him see exactly what he expected to see. A wild-eyed woman with hacked-off hair and blood on her hands from the glass, screaming about voices and fire, and men who wouldn't stop hitting someone she loved. His face went slack with alarm, exactly as she'd hoped, and in the moment, his attention snagged on the horror of her appearance instead of the danger of her position. She brought the bedpost down across the back of his skull. He dropped without much sound, more surprise than pain in the way he crumpled, and Clara stood over him a moment, breathing hard, waiting to see if he would stir. He didn't. She knelt and found the keys at his belt, along with a small revolver. She took without a second thought, and stepped over him into the hallway. The house was quiet at this hour, most of the staff asleep. Her father's study dark and empty at the end of the hall. She should have run straight for the stables. Instead, she found herself standing outside her father's study door, thinking of the black ledger he kept locked in his safe, the one Sheriff Miller had once mentioned in passing. The record of every bribe and every crime that had built this empire out of stolen water and burned land. She knew the combination. She'd watched him work it 100 times as a child. never understanding what she was memorizing until this exact moment. Her hands shook as she turned the dial, but the tumblers fell into place anyway, and the safe swung open to reveal exactly what she'd hoped for. Ledgers, deeds, a thick stack of letters bearing signatures that would ruin half the officials in the territory if anyone ever saw them. She took the largest and most damning of the ledgers, wrapped it in an oilcloth she found on her father's desk, and tucked it beneath her arm. Then she went for the stables, moving low and fast through shadow, and found a horse still saddled from the night's ride, left ready in case her father needed to move quickly. She swung up onto it, with the ledgers secured against her body and the stolen revolver heavy in her waistband, and rode out into the dark without looking back at the house that had raised her. She didn't know yet where Silas was being held. She only knew she wasn't done fighting for him, not while there was still breath in her body to do it. She found out where they were holding him from the same stable boy who'd once told her where to find Gray's ranch, rousing him from sleep at his family's small house on the edge of town, with the last of her coin and a story about needing to reach a sick relative. He told her without much hesitation, the way people tell things to a desperate stranger who looks like she has nothing left to lose. The territorial jail, out past the courthouse, guarded but not heavily, since nobody in town figured a half-dead man with a broken leg needed much watching. Broken leg. The words landed hard in her chest. Confirmation, at least, that he was alive, alongside confirmation of exactly how badly they'd hurt him. She left her stolen horse tied in the trees a quarter-mile from the jail and approached on foot, moving low through the same rain that had never fully let up since the night of the flood. Grateful now for the noise of it, covering her footsteps, and the mud that hid her tracks. She knew this compound better than any lawman guarding it. She'd grown up learning her father's habits, his patterns, the way he built every piece of his territory to serve his convenience rather than genuine security. She knew where the guards took their smoke breaks. She knew which doors stuck in wet weather and which one didn't lock properly at all, because her father had never bothered fixing what he considered beneath his notice. She used all of it. She waited in the shadow of the courthouse until she heard the changing of the guard. Two men trading a lazy conversation about cards and whiskey, while a third somewhere inside dozed through his watch and slipped through the unlocked side door while their attention was elsewhere. The holding cells were worse than she'd imagined. Cold stone, no windows, a single lantern burning low at the end of the corridor, and Silas in the last cell, slumped against the wall with his legs splinted crudely and wrapped in blood-stained cloth, his face still swollen and bruised from the beating in the canyon. For one terrible moment, she thought she'd come too late, that the stillness of him meant the worst had already happened. Then his eyes opened, slow and unfocused, and found her through the bars. Clara, his voice came out cracked and disbelieving. "What are you doing here? They'll kill you if they catch you." "They already tried to lock me away for good," she whispered, working the stolen keys against the lock, with hands that shook worse than she wanted to admit. "I'm not interested in giving them a second chance." The lock gave with a soft click, and she pushed the door open and knelt beside him, taking in the full extent of the damage up close. His leg was bad, bone likely broken in more than one place beneath the crude splint someone had bothered to apply, probably only to keep him alive long enough for the hanging her father had promised. He was too heavy for her to lift easily, and every movement clearly cost him in pain. He was trying hard not to show. "I can't walk far on this," he said. "You should go." "Clara, save yourself. There's no sense both of us dying out here. I didn't cut off all my hair and knock out a guard with a bedpost just to leave you here," she said, sliding herself under his arm and bracing her whole body to take his weight. "Get up. We're doing this together, or not at all." He tried, and the sound he made, trying not to cry out from the pain of it nearly, broke her resolve entirely. But between his good leg and her stubborn strength, they got him upright, and then moving, one agonizing step at a time down the corridor. Every sound felt enormous in the quiet of the jail. Every scrape of his boot against stone, every ragged breath, he couldn't quite silence. They made it out the side door and into the rain, and from there the real trial began, dragging his larger frame through mud that sucked at both their boots. Staying low along the tree line to avoid the searchlights, the guards had started sweeping across the yard once someone finally noticed the empty cell. Clara had never in her life done physical labor like this, had never understood what it cost a body to carry someone else's weight across half a mile of open, muddy ground while men with rifles searched the darkness for exactly the shapes they made. Silas passed out twice before they reached the horse, the pain and blood loss finally outpacing his will to stay conscious. And both times Clara had to half carry, half drag him the remaining distance alone, sobbing with effort and fear and refusing, absolutely refusing, to let go of him even once. "Stay with me," she begged the second time, slapping gently at his face until his eyes fluttered open again. "Silas, please, stay with me. We're almost there." "Still here," he mumbled, barely audible. "Not going anywhere. Not while you're still fighting this hard." They reached the horse finally, and getting him up into the saddle, nearly finished what the beating had started. But between his remaining strength and her desperate determination, they managed it, and Clara climbed up behind him, wrapping one arm tight around his middle to keep him from sliding, the other hand on the reins. Behind them, shouts rose up from the jail as the search widened, lantern light bobbing through the rain, and Clara kicked the horse into as much speed as it could manage, carrying two riders through mud that grabbed at every stride. She didn't look back. She had learned something in the last 2 days about the cost of looking back, about how it slowed a person down at exactly the moment speed mattered most. They rode until the horse was blowing hard, and Silas had gone dangerously quiet against her, and she finally slowed at a stand of trees near a dry creek bed, far enough from town that the searchlights had faded to nothing behind them. She checked his breathing first, found it ragged but steady, and allowed herself one shaking breath of relief before turning her mind to what came next. They were exposed here, wounded, exhausted, riding a horse that couldn't carry them much farther without rest. Her father would not stop searching. He had already shown exactly how far he was willing to go to protect his empire, and a runaway daughter with his most damning ledger in her possession represented a threat he couldn't simply write off as youthful rebellion anymore. He would come himself this time, or send men who wouldn't make the mistake of leaving either of them alive. Clara looked down at Silas, pale and hurting against her, and then at the ledger, still wrapped and secured against her own body, and understood that running wasn't going to be enough. Her father wouldn't stop hunting them across the territory, not with what she carried, not after what she'd already cost him. At some point, this had to end somewhere other than running. She didn't know yet exactly how, but she knew the abandoned mission church out past the territory line, the one Elias had once mentioned as a landmark for travelers heading west, might buy them the time and the ground they needed to stop running and start deciding things on their own terms for once. She turned the horse toward it into the last hour before dawn, carrying a broken man and a ledger full of sins, and rode like a woman who had already decided she would rather stand and fight than spend one more night being hunted. The mission church sat crumbling at the edge of the territory, roof half caved in, walls scorched pale by decades of sun, the kind of place travelers used as a landmark and nobody used as shelter. Clara got Silas down off the horse and into the shade of the one intact wall, propping him against the adobe with the last of her strength, and watched dawn break gray and reluctant over the flat land around them. There was nowhere left to run from here. The land opened flat in every direction. No cover, no trail forward that didn't leave them exposed for miles. She understood, settling beside Silas, with the ledger still wrapped against her chest, that this was the ground where things would finally get decided, one way or the other. Silas drifted in and out through the morning, fever climbing from the wound in his leg, and Clara did what she could with the little she had, tearing strips from her own shirt to change the dressing. forcing water past his cracked lips when he'd let her. He was in no condition to fight anyone. Whatever came next, it would fall to her alone to meet it. She heard the horses before she saw them, a low rumble of hooves carrying across the flat ground. And by the time she stood and looked out through the church's broken doorway, she could already make out her father's posse cresting the far rise. A dozen riders, maybe more. Her father at the front on his gray gelding, Sheriff Miller beside him, rifles slung and ready. Clara, Silas rasped from behind her, struggling to push himself upright against the wall. "Get me a weapon. I can still shoot from here." "You can barely sit up," she said, though the words cost her, because some stubborn part of her wanted exactly that. Wanted him beside her, with a gun in his hand, instead of what she was about to do instead. Then, what's the plan? She looked down at the ledger in her arms, at the lantern she'd taken from the jail, still hanging from her saddle, and felt the shape of an answer settle over her, cold and clear. "The plan is I finish what I started," she said. "Rest. Whatever happens, I need you alive when it's over." She stepped out through the broken doorway before he could argue further, into the flat morning light, and walked out to meet the riders instead of waiting for them to come, find her cowering in the shadows. She carried the ledger in one hand and the lantern in the other, already lit, the flames small but steady in the still morning air. The revolver she'd taken from the guard sat tucked in her waistband, and she let her hand rest near it without drawing it. Not yet. Her father raised a hand, and the posse slowed, then stopped, 30 yards out. Rifle still raised, but not yet fired. Harlan Vance sat his horse and studied his daughter across the distance, taking in the ragged hair, the men's clothes, the bundle in her arms, with an expression that held no fear in it at all, only mild, cold curiosity, like a man assessing an unexpected complication in an otherwise simple transaction. "You look like something the flood spat out," he said finally. "Come home, Clara. Whatever fever's gotten into you these last few days, we can still fix this quietly. Nobody outside this posse needs to know the details." "I'm not coming home," Clara said, and her voice carried steady across the flat ground, steadier than she felt. "Not to that house, not to that life. Then you'll die out here with your Mustang tamer," Harlan said, "which strikes me as a poor trade for everything I built for you." "You didn't build anything for me," Clara said. "You built a cage and called it inheritance. You built an empire on land you stole and blood you spilled. And you expected me to wear it like a wedding gift." She lifted the ledger higher, letting the morning light catch the worn leather cover. "I know what's in here, Father. Every bribe, every judge you own, every man you've had killed to clear land you wanted. I read enough of it before I left your safe to understand exactly what kind of man raised me." Something shifted in Harlan's expression then, the first real crack in his composure, and Sheriff Miller shot him a sharp, alarmed glance that told Clara everything about how much the sheriff himself stood to lose if that ledger ever saw daylight. "Give me the book, Clara," Harlan said, voice gone tight. "Whatever grievance you're nursing, this isn't the way to settle it. I'm not giving you anything." She lowered the ledger toward the lantern's flame, close enough that the men behind her father shifted uneasily in their saddles. "You're going to let us ride out of here, both of us. And you're going to call off every man in this territory who might come looking afterward, or I burn this book right here, right now. And you can explain to every judge and lawman named in these pages exactly why the evidence that kept them loyal to you went up in smoke instead of into a courtroom where it might have bought their silence permanently." "Bluffing," Harlan said. "You'd never destroy something that valuable." "Watch me," Clara said, and lowered it another inch toward the flame, close enough now that the leather cover began to warm and darken at the edge. "Wait." The word came out of him sharper than he probably intended, and several of the men behind him exchanged glances that told Clara exactly how thin her father's authority over this posse had suddenly become. Men who'd been bribed into loyalty had a way of reconsidering that loyalty the moment their own names appeared in danger of exposure. "Owning the dirt beneath our feet doesn't give you the right to own human lives," Clara said, her voice steadier now, gaining strength with every word, like she was finally saying something she'd needed to say her whole life. You taught me that lesson without meaning to. Father, you taught me what it looks like when a man decides other people are just obstacles between him and what he wants. Civilization isn't measured by how many railroads you build or how much water you control. It's measured by how you treat the people who have no power to stop you. By that measure, you've built nothing but ruin. Harlan sat his horse in silence, jaw tight, eyes flicking between his daughter and the men flanking him, clearly recalculating the odds of this situation in real time. Sheriff Miller had gone pale, his hand no longer quite so steady on his rifle, and Clara understood she'd found the true weakness in her father's power. Not the guns, the book. The men who served him out of fear of exposure would abandon him the moment exposure became the greater danger. Let us ride out, Clara said again, or your empire burns down around you, along with this book, one way or another. You've spent your whole life building something on other people's suffering. I'm the only leverage you have left to protect it, and I am done being used that way. The standoff held a long, taut moment, wind moving low across the flat ground. The small flame of the lantern, flickering steady beside the ledger's darkening edge. Clara watched her father's face and saw, for the first time in her whole life, something that might have been recognition. Not love, not regret. Exactly. Recognition, cold and clear. That the daughter he'd shaped through fear and control had learned his own methods well enough to turn them back against him. Lower your rifles, Harlan said finally. Quiet, and the posse's tension broke like a held breath, finally released. Let them ride. Harlan Miller started. I said, lower them. Harlan snapped, and something in his voice had gone hollow. Defeated in a way Clara had never once heard from him in 24 years. She's made her point clear enough. We're finished here. Clara backed away slowly, ledger and lantern still both in hand, watching the posse until she'd put enough distance between them to feel something loosen in her chest. Her father watched her go without another word, his face unreadable, and she understood that whatever passed between them in that moment marked the true end of everything that had once bound them together as family. She went back into the church and found Silas watching from the doorway, having dragged himself upright against the frame to see what he could of the standoff outside. You did that unarmed, he said, disbelief plain in his voice. Talked down an entire posse with a book and a lantern. I learned from a man who taught a wild Mustang to trust him without ever raising a hand against it, Clara said, kneeling beside him, letting the ledger drop finally from her shaking grip. Turns out the same lesson works on men, if you're patient enough and stubborn enough to see it through. Silas reached for her hand, and she let him take it. And together, they watched through the broken doorway as her father's posse turned and rode back the way they'd come, leaving the flat morning ground empty except for two people who had nothing left but each other and whatever came next. They built the homestead slow, over months that tested every ounce of patience either of them had left after everything the last year had cost them. Silas's leg never healed straight, and he walked the rest of his life with a limp that ached worse in cold weather, a permanent reminder of the night he'd nearly died protecting people who weren't his blood, but had become his family regardless. Clara's hands, once smooth and manicured, went rough and calloused from raising fence posts and working a garden and learning, slowly, every skill her sheltered upbringing had never bothered teaching her. Word came through the territory over that first year that Harlan Vance's business had begun unraveling from the inside, deals falling through, partners growing suddenly cautious, judges who'd once done his bidding without question, finding reasons to distance themselves instead. Nobody ever proved exactly why. Clara never spoke publicly about the ledger, never used it as more than the leverage it had already served, as that morning outside the mission church. But its existence hung over her father's remaining years like smoke he could never quite outrun. He died some years later, wealthy still by most measures, but alone in a house that had never once been a home. And Clara felt when the news reached her. Something quieter and stranger than either grief or satisfaction. Just the recognition that some stories end not in reconciliation, but simply in distance. And that distance itself could be its own kind of peace. Elias came to visit often in those early years, watching Silas and Clara build their small, rugged house with the same patient satisfaction he'd once shown watching Silas gentle a frightened Mustang. He brought stories from the homesteader families, from the Shoshone community that had rebuilt further west along safer ground, all of them carrying forward the same lesson Silas had first spoken aloud in a corral to a woman who hadn't yet understood how badly she needed to hear it. You don't build lasting trust through force. You build it through patience, through respecting what frightens people, through proving over and over that you mean them no harm until believing it stops feeling like a risk. Their door stayed open to exactly the kind of people the world had decided weren't worth protecting. A widow with 3 children and nowhere else to go. A young Shoshone man who'd lost his whole family to fever and needed work before he needed pity. An old drifter who'd once ridden with rougher men and wanted, late in life, to try being something better. Clara fed them at her table without asking much about their past, and Silas taught the ones who wanted it the same lesson he'd once taught her about the horses. Patience over force. Trust earned slowly instead of demanded outright. And one by one, their small, rugged homestead grew into something that looked less like a house and more like a community built on exactly the values Harlan Vance had spent his whole life trampling. Some evenings, Clara sat on the porch and thought back to the woman who'd first arrived in that Wyoming boomtown in silken pearls, raised to be decorative and obedient and nothing more, and felt almost like she was remembering someone else's life entirely. That woman had never known what her own hands could build, had never understood that safety bought through obedience wasn't safety at all, just a slower kind of danger, dressed up in comfort. It had taken losing everything, her name, her wealth, her place in a world built on cruelty, to finally understand what she actually wanted her life to mean. On a clear evening near the end of that first hard year, Clara stood in the corral, brushing down a young Mustang she'd been gentling herself these past months, using every lesson Silas had first shown her in that same kind of enclosure. Patience instead of force. Stillness instead of control. Her hands had gone rough with work. Her hair had grown back shaggy and uneven, cropped short still, from the night she'd cut it free of everything her father's world had once demanded of her. She wore men's trousers caked with the day's dirt, and she had never in her whole sheltered upbringing felt more entirely herself. Silas came out onto the porch behind her, favoring the leg that never healed quite right, and watched her work a moment before making his way down toward the corral fence. He didn't rush her, same as he'd never rushed the horses, understanding instinctively that some things were better arrived at slowly, on their own terms. She's coming along, he said, nodding at the Mustang, leaning into Clara's brushstrokes. She trusts me now, Clara said. Took longer than I expected, but she trusts me. That's usually how it goes with anything worth having. He came up behind her, careful of his bad leg, and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin against her shoulder the way he had 100 times since that first storm-soaked night in the ranch's kitchen. Wouldn't have believed it. The first day I saw you in that carriage, all done up in silk. Never figured you for someone who'd end up happiest standing in a corral covered in dirt. Neither did I, Clara admitted, leaning back into him, feeling the solid, familiar weight of his arms around her. My father spent my whole life teaching me that safety meant staying small and obedient. Turns out real safety looks a lot more like this. Dirt under my nails. A home that's mine because I built it, not because someone handed it to me as a cage dressed up as a gift. They stood there a long while in the fading light. 2 people who had lost everything society once told them mattered. Wealth, reputation, the safe and narrow futures they'd both been handed at birth, and had found instead something neither of them had ever been taught to expect. A home built on patience instead of force. A love earned through trust instead of demanded through fear. A life stripped down to what actually mattered, and rebuilt, slow and deliberate, on ground finally worth calling their own. The Mustang nudged Clara's shoulder, impatient for more of the brush, and she laughed, low and easy, the sound of a woman who had finally, after everything, found her way home. And so Clara Vance's journey did not end with wealth, comfort, or the approval of the powerful people who had once controlled her life. It ended with something far more valuable: freedom, dignity, and a home built by her own hands. When Clara first arrived in Wyoming, she had everything society claimed a woman should desire. She had fine dresses, a respected family name, an arranged marriage, and the promise of a comfortable future. Yet beneath all of that luxury, she was living inside a cage. Her father had taught her that safety meant obedience, that love meant control, and that her value depended on how quietly she followed the path chosen for her. But the story reminds us that a beautiful cage is still a cage, and a comfortable life without freedom is not truly living. Clara's transformation began when she saw Silas Thorne standing between helpless families and armed men. He had no powerful name, no great fortune, and no army behind him. All he had was the courage to stand where others were afraid to stand. Through Silas, Clara discovered that real strength does not always shout, threaten, or dominate. Sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes it is the patience to earn the trust of a wounded horse. Sometimes it is the willingness to protect strangers even when no one will reward you. And sometimes it is simply the courage to say, "This is wrong," when everyone around you has chosen silence. One of the most important lessons in this story is that trust cannot be forced. Silas never broke horses through fear, because he understood that obedience created by pain was not loyalty. He waited, respected their fear, and allowed them to approach him on their own terms. That lesson became the heart of Clara's own awakening. For her entire life, her father had demanded obedience and called it love. Silas offered patience and called it trust. One relationship made her feel smaller. The other allowed her to discover who she truly was. The story asks us to examine the relationships in our own lives. Do the people around us encourage us to grow, speak, and choose freely? Or do they use fear, guilt, money, or authority to keep us obedient? Real love does not imprison. It does not demand that we surrender our conscience. Real love respects our boundaries, honors our choices, and helps us become stronger. Clara also teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear. She was terrified when she rode through the storm. She was afraid when she defied her father, escaped her locked room, entered the jail, and faced an armed posse with only a ledger and a lantern. But she continued despite that fear. Courage was not something she suddenly discovered inside herself. It was something she built through every decision. One step across the hallway, one ride through the darkness, one refusal to remain silent. Her story shows that ordinary people do not become brave all at once. They become brave each time they choose what is right over what is easy. The story also reminds us that silence has consequences. Clara had spent years watching her father use wealth and influence to destroy lives. She had been trained not to question him, and for a long time she believed that remaining silent kept her innocent. But when she learned that innocent families were about to be murdered, she understood that doing nothing was also a choice. She could no longer purchase her own safety with the suffering of others. That truth applies far beyond the frontier. Whenever cruelty is protected by silence, injustice grows stronger. We may not always be able to defeat a powerful enemy alone, but we can refuse to cooperate with wrongdoing. We can speak, warn, protect, document, and stand beside those who are being pushed aside. Harlan Vance believed power meant owning land, controlling water, buying lawmen, and frightening people into submission. Yet his empire began to collapse because power built on fear is always fragile. The men who followed him were never truly loyal. They were only protecting themselves. Clara, by contrast, built something much smaller but far more lasting. She and Silas created a home where widows, wanderers, native families, and broken people could find food, work, and respect. Harlan built an empire that left him alone. Clara built a community that gave others a place to belong. That contrast teaches us that success should not be measured only by money, property, or influence. The true measure of a life is what we build inside other people. Do they feel safer because we were there? Do they feel heard? Do they leave our presence with more hope than they had before? All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.